Genius silicon algorithm engineer Ethan spends 2 years building a factory's core patent system in silence out of love for his wife Chloe. However, Chloe snatches his award for her ambiguous senior colleague, Julian, at a corporate banquet and publicly humiliates Ethan as a mere handyman. Having long endured Chloe's favoritism toward Julian and disregard for his work, Ethan revokes all patent licenses, shutting down 12 production lines and triggering massive corporate losses. After 47 unanswered desperate calls from Chloe, Ethan shuns her and learns the full truth of Julian's intellectual theft and Chloe's blind partiality. Faced with burnt machinery, client claims, and board pressure, Chloe realizes her wrongdoing, corrects the patent authorship, and apologizes sincerely. Ethan reactivates the system, and the two attempt to fix their unbalanced marriage amid cold industrial algorithms. The story explores love, dignity, and redemption, raising lingering questions. Can Ethan fully forgive Chloe's humiliation and neglect? Will Chloe ever truly cherish his talent and hidden affection? Can their tech-mended marriage avoid repeating past rifts? The champagne tower glinted honey gold under the spotlight, tiny bubbles climbing 3 millimeters upward every second on the 6th tier, popping against the surface with a sound so faint it might have been the last breath of some deep-sea creature. Chloe Bennet stood atop the hastily erected awards stage, her gilded microphone catching the curve of her collarbone. The hem of her Givenchy full pencil skirt sliced a sharp arc as she shifted her weight. The very same designer piece Ethan Hale had charged to his unlimited corporate card for her birthday the week prior. At this moment, draped in that gift, she drove a knife slow and deep into the softest part of the man who'd bought it for her. This patent would never have hit production ahead of schedule without Julian Carter, my senior lab partner. Her voice filtered through the venue's sound system, warm and fuzzy like cashmere brushing skin, yet sharp with static that pricked the eardrums. Without his breakthroughs in algorithm architecture, we would still be groping blindly in the dark for months on end. Polite, restrained applause rippled through the ballroom. Mark Sanders from marketing shot to his feet first, his tie clip flaring a thin beam of light straight into Ethan's eyes. He squinted, watching Julian rise from the second row in a tailored navy suit, cufflinks set with sapphires, the exact pair Ethan had lost out on at Sotheby's auction the month before. Those jewels glinted with every step Julian took toward the stage, each flash burning a tiny searing mark onto Ethan's retinas. Of course. Chloe's gaze finally drifted to Ethan, tucked away in the far corner of the banquet hall, lingering no longer than a single shallow breath. We owe thanks to every member of the tech team for their support, especially Ethan, who's helped out with all the grunt work these past few months. The phrase grunt work landed crisp and deliberate, like an ice chip tapping against porcelain. A slice of untouched millefeuille sat on the bone china plate before Ethan, its flaky pastry slowly soaking up vanilla custard, wilting and collapsing as if stripped of its skeleton. A quiet chuckle echoed from behind him. Dr. Felix Mercer, the newly recruited overseas researcher whose doctoral advisor was a Turing Award laureate. The laugh feather-light, yet it pierced Ethan's ears like a shard of glass. He did not lift his head to meet Chloe's eyes. He knew her stage posture too well. Her left shoulder dipped 2 degrees lower than her right, a telltale slant that surfaced whenever she was overcome with excitement or control. Right now, that tilt radiated an almost feral sense of command. Once, that confident lean had captivated him. Now, it curdled acid in his stomach. He remembered her first department presentation 3 years prior. That same lopsided shoulder, that same bright fire in her eyes. Only back then, she'd dart a quick glance his way mid-speech, as if anchoring herself to his presence. Julian reached the stage and accepted the crystal trophy from Chloe with effortless ease, his fingertips resting half a heartbeat too long against the back of her hand. The trophy's faceted edges split the ballroom's overhead spotlights into a prismatic rainbow, one thin streak landing directly on Ethan's ring finger. A pale, faded band indentation marked the skin there. He'd slipped off his wedding band before leaving the house that night, the faint copper stain glinting dimly beneath the lights, a faint, healed scar. Ethan's phone vibrated once in his suit pocket. He didn't need to check the screen to know it was Rick Torres, the floor foreman, likely messaging to ask if they needed to keep night shift staff on duty. The temperature control module on reactor line 4 had drifted slightly off kilter lately, never enough to tank production yield, but enough to grate on Ethan's obsessive eye for clean data. He pulled the device out long enough to type 3 quick words. Stick to baseline parameters, then hit the power button. Before the screen faded black, he caught a glimpse of his lock screen, a photo of Chloe from her birthday trip to Japan, leaning against his shoulder, a matcha ice cream cone smudged at the corner of her mouth. His thumb hovered over the image for a split second before he stuffed the phone back into his pocket. A third bottle of champagne was uncorked, its pop echoing through the crowd. Chloe wove between round tables, throwing her head back in laughter, her makeup stretched tight over her cheekbones to craft a youthful, polished smile. Julian trailed half a step behind her, his hand hovering loosely at the small of her back, that ambiguous, unspoken boundary between close colleague and secret lover. Ethan tracked Julian's subtle repositioning 3 separate times throughout the reception. Each shift positioned him as a living screen, blocking Chloe's line of sight to Ethan entirely. He set down his wine glass slowly. The leftover Bordeaux pooled into a dark red splotch on the cream linen tablecloth, its edges drying into a deeper, bruised ring, an expanding marker of wasted time. Ethan slipped away without drawing a single eye. His chair barely creaked against the thick carpet as he stood, slipping out through the side exit. He nearly collided with a server balancing a stack of empty champagne flutes around the hallway, bend. One rim bore a smudge of dusty rose lipstick, the exact shade Chloe had worn that evening, pearlescent under the cool corridor lighting. He stepped aside to let the server pass, his gaze lingering on that faint lipstick mark for a heartbeat. The corridor's AC cranked the temperature down far too low, polished marble stretching into an unbroken ribbon of ceiling light, leading straight to the bank of elevators. He pressed the button marked B3, the hidden workshop that housed his real workstation, unlisted on any official organizational chart. As the elevator doors slid shut, he caught his reflection in the stainless steel panel. His face hollow and blank, only a faint vertical crease etched between his brows, the permanent mark of weeks spent pulling all-nighters debugging code. A faint, weightless lull swept over him as the car descended, dragging him back to the night he'd first tested his proprietary algorithm database 2 years and 4 months prior. 72 straight hours of watching 16 parallel processing modules flood raw datasets, each stream wandering random parameter spaces, mutating, discarding failures, evolving toward perfection. He dragged a folding cot down to B3, surviving on compressed protein bars and bottled water, only leaving the room 4 times to use the restroom. On the 73rd hour, a complete, elegant, flawless logical chain emerged from the chaotic data, like the first stable atomic nucleus forged after the Big Bang. All he'd done was brew a cheap instant coffee, then encrypt and back up the breakthrough across 3 separate secure storage locations. An old server in Professor Arthur Wells' home office, an expired cloud storage account he'd forgotten about for years, and a USB drive tucked inside a vintage hardcover copy of Tom in the Golden Vase Arsos on his bookshelf. The elevator dinged, sliding open to reveal B3's sterile, industrial corridor, a world entirely disconnected from the glitzy gala upstairs. Epoxy flooring, matte grey anti-static wall coating, and non-stop cool white LED strips erased all shadows. At the far end loomed a massive reinforced steel door, unmarked save for a tiny fingerprint scanner embedded into its frame. He pressed his thumb to the panel. A green light flickered, and hydraulic pistons hummed low as the slab slid silently open. The room's temperature hovered at a steady 64 degrees Fahrenheit, the optimal operating range for the server racks lining the walls. Their status lights pulsed in rotating cycles of blue, green, and white, a silent mating call from some alien deep-sea creature. He stepped to the main control console, his fingers hovering half an inch above the touchscreen for 3 full seconds. This room held the heart of the patent, a self-evolving algorithm database capable of recalibrating thousands of production variables across 12 full manufacturing lines in real time. Corporate leadership had allocated an $8 million budget for the project, yet Ethan had only spent less than $2 million. Every core line of code had been written by his hand down in B3, late into hundreds of nights. Chloe knew the system was powerful, but she had no grasp of its full capacity. She'd never even asked how he'd stretched the funding so thin, unaware half the budget had gone towards second-hand server hardware, the rest buried under stacks of empty energy drink cans and instant coffee cups on his desk. The touchscreen flared to life, the password prompt stark and unforgiving against the black background. He typed the first 32-character encryption key, a jumble of capital letters, numbers, and symbols, built from a hashing algorithm he'd dreamed up during one sleepless night. The date of their first date, the serial number of the movie ticket they'd shared, and the exact count of sepals on the single rose he'd bought her afterward. A warning flashed across the screen. Patent license revocation will disable all production lines. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. Proceed? The number 12 burned into his vision for 3 long seconds. He replayed the memory of Chloe bursting through the B3 steel door earlier that week, the second time she'd ventured down that floor all year, clutching Julian's research proposal. She'd begged him to unlock partial access to the database's core logic so Julian could draft a submission for a Nature Journal subsidiary. Ethan had told her to wait, explaining unrefined variables risked destabilizing the entire framework. Chloe's easy smile had vanished in an instant, her tone sharp and bitter. "When did you get so petty, Ethan? Julian's practically family, and he put plenty of work into this patent's launch too." He'd wanted to snap back that every core algorithm description in the filing paperwork had been typed out solely by him, but he'd swallowed the words, pausing his active simulation with a few quick keystrokes. Chloe had spun on her heel and stormed out, her heels clicking far louder against epoxy than the carpet upstairs, like ice striking glass. Now he tapped confirm. The second security layer demanded biometric verification. He rested his thumb against the fingerprint sensor, a tiny buzz vibrating the console as it mapped every ridge and whirl, akin to an insect's rapid wing beat. An iris scanner rose from beneath the control panel, a thin red laser grid sweeping across his pupils. He remembered Chloe watching him register his biometrics years prior, laughing off his elaborate security measures as overkill, unaware he'd always been quietly afraid someone would steal the work he'd poured years of his life into. The final authentication step required a dynamic passcode generated by a tiny black fob hanging from his keychain. Chloe had asked twice what the device was, and each time he'd lied, claiming it controlled the garage gate opener. He twisted the fob free from his ring, pressed the side indentation for 3 seconds, and typed the 8-digit sequence onto the screen. All security checks cleared. The revocation sequence initiated, its progress bar creeping steadily forward, 1% at a time. Ethan leaned back in his office chair, watching each production line icon shift from bright green to muted grey. Line A cut first, then B, then C. Every shutdown stamped a 16-digit timestamp into the server logs, precise down to the nanosecond. Staring at the scrolling data, he recalled the day of the system's official validation. Chloe had stood before the main upstairs monitoring wall, watching streams of live manufacturing data race across the screens, a light in her eyes he'd never seen before. She turned and wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "We did it, Ethan." Then Julian had stepped forward, clapping him on the shoulder and suggesting dinner to celebrate. That entire meal, Chloe had spoken only to Julian about their next research project, while Ethan sat silent, peeling shrimp after shrimp. A sharp spike from the shell pricked his thumb, drawing a tiny bead of blood. No one at the table noticed as he pressed a crumpled napkin to the wound. The progress bar hit 100%. A thin line of text popped onto the display. All patent licensing permissions revoked. System operating in base maintenance mode. Full operational continuity will be compromised within 72 hours without reauthorization. Ethan's phone vibrated once in his suit pocket. He didn't need to check the screen to know it was Rick Torres, the floor foreman, likely messaging to ask if they needed to keep night shift staff on duty. The temperature control module on reactor line 4 had drifted slightly off kilter lately. Never enough to tank production yield, but enough to grate on Ethan's obsessive eye for clean data. He pulled the device out long enough to type 3 quick words. Stick to baseline parameters, then hit the power button. Before the screen faded black, he caught a glimpse of his lock screen. A photo of Chloe from her birthday trip to Japan, leaning against his shoulder, a matcha ice cream cone smudged at the corner of her mouth. His thumb hovered over the image for a split second before he stuffed the phone back into his pocket. A third bottle of champagne was uncorked, its pop echoing through the crowd. Chloe wove between round tables, throwing her head back in laughter, her makeup stretched tight over her cheekbones to craft a youthful, polished smile. Julian trailed half a step behind her, his hand hovering loosely at the small of her back, that ambiguous, unspoken boundary between close colleague and secret lover. Ethan tracked Julian's subtle repositioning 3 separate times throughout the reception. Each shift positioned him as a living screen, blocking Chloe's line of sight to Ethan entirely. He set down his wine glass slowly. The leftover Bordeaux pooled into a dark red splotch on the cream linen tablecloth, its edges drying into a deeper, bruised ring, an expanding marker of wasted time. Ethan slipped away without drawing a single eye. His chair barely creaked against the thick carpet as he stood, slipping out through the side exit. He nearly collided with a server balancing a stack of empty champagne flutes around the hallway. Bend. One rim bore a smudge of dusty rose lipstick, the exact shade Chloe had worn that evening, pearlescent under the cool corridor lighting. He stepped aside to let the server pass, his gaze lingering on that faint lipstick mark for a heartbeat. The corridor's AC cranked the temperature down far too low, polished marble stretching into an unbroken ribbon of ceiling light leading straight to the bank of elevators. He pressed the button marked B3, the hidden workshop that housed his real workstation, unlisted on any official organizational chart. As the elevator doors slid shut, he caught his reflection in the stainless steel panel. His face, hollow and blank, only a faint vertical crease etched between his brows, the permanent mark of weeks spent pulling all-nighters debugging code. A faint, weightless lull swept over him as the car descended, dragging him back to the night he'd first tested his proprietary algorithm database, 2 years and 4 months prior. 72 straight hours of watching, 16 parallel processing modules flood raw datasets, each stream wandering random parameter spaces, mutating, discarding failures, evolving toward perfection. He dragged a folding cot down to B3, surviving on compressed protein bars and bottled water, only leaving the room 4 times to use the restroom. On the 73rd hour, a complete, elegant, flawless logical chain emerged from the chaotic data, like the first stable atomic nucleus forged after the Big Bang. All he'd done was brew a cheap instant coffee, then encrypt and back up the breakthrough across 3 separate secure storage locations: an old server in Professor Arthur Wells' home office, an expired cloud storage account he'd forgotten about for years, and a USB drive tucked inside a vintage hardcover copy of The Plum in the Golden Vase on his bookshelf. The elevator dinged, sliding open to reveal B3's sterile, industrial corridor, a world entirely disconnected from the glitzy gala upstairs. Epoxy flooring, matte grey anti-static wall coating, and non-stop cool white LED strips erased all shadows. At the far end loomed a massive reinforced steel door, unmarked save for a tiny fingerprint scanner embedded into its frame. He pressed his thumb to the panel. A green light flickered, and hydraulic pistons hummed low as the slab slid silently open. The room's temperature hovered at a steady 64 degrees Fahrenheit, the optimal operating range for the server racks lining the walls. Their status lights pulsed in rotating cycles of blue, green, and white, a silent mating call from some alien deep-sea creature. He stepped to the main control console, his fingers hovering half an inch above the touchscreen for 3 full seconds. Ethan curled the cool metal into his palm, its sharp edge digging into his lifelines. "Thank you, Professor." "No thanks needed. You slept on lab cots through countless all-night coding sessions during your undergrad years, remember?" That night, Ethan lay awake in the guest room for hours, unable to rest. Heavy blackout curtains blocked most light, but a thin sliver of street lamp glow sliced a straight pale line across the ceiling. He stared at that strip of illumination, replaying the gala's brutal sequence over and over. Chloe pressing the trophy into Julian's palm, the fractional pause of their fingers touching, the blank indifference in her eyes when she referenced his grunt work. He thought back to their wedding night, bathed in identical soft lamplight, Chloe standing before him in white lace, whispering, "I do." He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment the light in her gaze had faded. Maybe the first time she'd snapped at him over a project delay to prioritize Julian's research. Maybe the day he'd found her phone, saved his senior lab partner under the contact nickname Julian. Or perhaps far earlier, during the hundreds of nights he'd buried himself in calibration work, while she attended industry galas alone. That spark had dimmed, bit by bit, long before the awards ceremony. He drifted into a fitful sleep around 3 a.m., his dreams filled with endless looping lines of code. Function blocks lined up like silent soldiers, each annotated with his name, until a figure in a wedding dress stepped forward, erasing every label with a pale pink rubber eraser, smiling serenely as she wiped all trace of his labor away. He jolted awake at dawn, grey light seeping through the curtain crack. From the kitchen, he heard the professor boiling water and the faint hum of a morning news radio broadcast. The anchor's voice cut through the quiet. Multiple production lines at a local high-tech manufacturing firm have experienced critical system failures early this morning, attributed to unplanned back-end software maintenance. The root cause remains under investigation. Ethan sat upright and grabbed his phone from the nightstand, the missed call counter climbing to 47, all originating from Chloe. He flipped the device to silent, screen down atop the pillow. Daylight flooded the neighborhood outside the window, and he listened to the professor chopping green onions on a wooden cutting board, a steady, rhythmic tap that echoed like a slow ticking clock. His stomach hollowed out, yet he had no appetite for food. Upstairs at corporate headquarters, the atmosphere in the executive boardroom hung thick enough to wring liquid from the air. Chloe sat at the head of the long conference table. Stacks of shutdown incident reports spread out before her. 4 cold mugs of coffee lined at her elbow. Undissolved sugar crystals settled heavy at the bottom of each cup. She'd stumbled home at 2 a.m. the night before to find the entryway lamp lit, Ethan's slippers neatly lined up by the shoe rack, exactly as he'd left them hours earlier. She'd changed into loungewear and wandered to the kitchen for water, spotting a folder laid flat on the dining table. A copy of the patent licensing agreement, weighed down by a small platinum band. Her wedding ring, etched with the date they'd married, on its inner curve. The signature block on the final page had been crossed out with thick black marker, the paper fibers frayed from how hard Ethan had pressed the pen. She'd stood frozen, holding the document, steam fogging her water glass, a cold shiver snaking down her spine before Rick's panicked call blared through her phone. All calibration parameters on line A collapsed entirely, the backup server unable to pull data from Ethan's custom database, the entire framework locked into maintenance-only mode. She'd sunk into a dining chair, the licensing paperwork slipping from her grasp to flutter onto the hardwood floor, and dialed Ethan non-stop from 3 a.m. onward. 47 unanswered calls stretching into the pale grey dawn. Now, every pair of eyes in the boardroom locked onto her. Julian sat to her right, his features tight with anxiety. "What's the tech team's assessment?" Colin Hayes, the lead senior engineer, pushed his glasses higher on his nose. "All core algorithm access keys have been fully revoked. We don't even have read-only permissions. It traced the shutdown command to a terminal on B3 last night at 11:17 p.m. That floor only grants Ethan clearance to log in." "Then find him!" Mark Sanders slammed his palm against the table, frustration sharp in his tone. "If he's not at home, check every spot he frequents. We can't let one single employee vanish and tank the entire operation." Chloe said nothing, staring down at her phone's call log. 47 red unanswered alerts lined up like a platoon of silent soldiers. She'd dialed the 48th time minutes prior, met with nothing but a monotonous, busy signal. Julian cleared his throat, tentative. "Should we activate the emergency backup framework we documented last year?" "It won't substitute," Colin cut him off flatly. "That's just a static data mirror. Every real-time tuning logic lives inside Ethan's proprietary database. We never received complete interface documentation. He offered to submit the files years ago, but you, Chloe, prioritized patent filing paperwork and told him to hold off indefinitely." Chloe sipped her bitter coffee, the sharp flavor searing her tongue and mixing with the exhaustion coiling tight in her chest. She recalled Ethan repeatedly bringing up the incomplete documentation handoff, yet she'd brushed him aside every time, consumed with securing grant funding for Julian's research, dismissing his concerns with a casual, "I trust your work. No rush." She couldn't even recall the last time he'd initiated a work-related conversation with her, growing accustomed to his quiet, uncomplaining compliance until the gala shattered that illusion. "Pull B3's entry logs," Chloe ordered. Ethan swiped his badge at 10:03 p.m., left at 10:51 p.m., and hasn't returned since, the IT lead replied, pulling up the digital records. Additionally, an external server sent a remote maintenance confirmation command at 6 this morning, locking the factory shutdown protocols permanently. "We can't trace the IP. It's routed through multiple anonymous proxy servers." Silence choked the boardroom, broken only by a distant metallic crash echoing up from the production floor. a robotic arm colliding with its safety limit stop, deprived of real-time positioning data. The dull, repetitive thud sounded like a giant machine drawing its final, labored breaths. Chloe shot to her feet, her chair scraping a shrill wail against the tile floor. "Mark, release a public notice stating temporary factory shutdowns for mandatory system upgrades." "How long can that cover us?" Mark huffed, defeated. 3 bulk customer shipments are scheduled for delivery today, and breach of contract penalties will be astronomical. "Charge all losses to my personal performance bonus," Chloe said softly, each word hammered solid into the air. "Give me 24 hours to resolve this." She stormed out of the boardroom, her heels striking the corridor floor twice as fast as normal, the phone pressed to her ear as the endless busy signal repeated. She hung up, opening her messaging app to Ethan's profile. His last text, sent 3 days prior. "Won't be home for dinner tonight," recalibrating parameters. She typed and deleted paragraph after paragraph, erasing every desperate plea until only a single line remained. "Where are you?" She hit send, and a scarlet exclamation mark popped up instantly. He'd blocked her number entirely. Chloe leaned her back against the cold corridor wall, squeezing her eyes shut. The gala replayed behind her eyelids in sharp, brutal fragments, the trophy heavy in her grasp, the engraved name Julian Carter etched into its base, the empty space on Ethan's ring finger, the untouched pastry on his table. She'd commissioned that trophy herself, double-checking every letter of the inscription, convinced Julian deserved top billing for theoretical framework oversight, while Ethan merely executed manual labor. It hit her then. She had never once bothered to read a single line of Ethan's code. She only reviewed polished summary reports, never curious about the complex machinery powering their production miracle. She'd only descended to B3 twice, each visit lasting less than 10 minutes, oblivious to the scale of the work unfolding beneath the main factory floors. She unlocked her contacts and dialed Professor Wells' number, a contact she'd saved years ago yet rarely called. The line rang twice before his gentle voice filtered through the speaker. "Chloe? It's been ages." "Professor," she struggled to steady her cracking tone. "Do you know where Ethan is?" A quiet pause stretched over the line. "He stopped by my house early this morning, stayed for a cup of tea, then left. He only asked whether I still stored the original design documents from his master's research project." "How did he seem?" "Calm, collected." Wells hesitated briefly. "Have the two of you argued?" Chloe offered no reply, muttering a quiet thank you before cutting the call. She stood frozen as morning sunlight flooded down the corridor, carving a blinding rectangle across the tile, and a wave of cold washed over her skin. Ethan spent the entire morning perched on a jagged stretch of rock at the city's undeveloped eastern beach. Moss coated the stone in dark green slime, slippery and frigid beneath his palms, and tiny hermit crabs scuttled across damp exposed sand as the tide receded, dragging their spiral shells behind them like homeless wanderers. He'd visited this shoreline during his undergraduate studies, and once with Chloe, back when she'd refused to wear heels, sprinting barefoot across the wet sand, her skirt soaked translucent by ocean spray, glancing over her shoulder to yell for him to catch up. Now that memory felt shrouded behind frosted glass, its colors faded and edges blurred beyond recognition. He set his backpack atop the rock, pulling a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his jacket pocket. He rarely smoked, only keeping a carton stashed for those brutal late nights when simulation runs crashed over and over again. He'd sit on the office rooftop, lighting a cigarette without inhaling, watching the smoke dissolve into the night wind. The lighter's flame sputtered repeatedly against the coastal breeze, forcing him to cup both hands around it to ignite the tobacco. His first drag triggered a harsh coughing fit, the smoke torn apart by wind and tangled with salt-laden sea air, a stark contrast to the sickly sweet champagne from the gala. He'd clutched that wine glass in his palm all night, staring at Chloe on stage, the cool glass still etched into his memory. His phone vibrated inside the backpack, one buzz, two, three, then silence, only to start again minutes later. He made no move to retrieve it, fixing his gaze on the grey-blue ocean stretching toward the horizon, a cargo freighter dragging a thin white scar across the water's surface far out at sea. He thought back to the first iteration of his algorithm database, a single hidden comment buried deep within tens of thousands of lines of core logic, marked with a shorthand only he could decode. TZH, the 9th of December 2018, the date of their first outing, and the exact number of sepals on the rose he bought her that rainy afternoon. Through every software overhaul and upgrade, that line had remained untouched, sealed away, like preserved amber at the heart of the code. He wondered if Chloe would ever stumble across it, if she'd recognize the shorthand and recall huddling under a tiny boba shop awning as rain soaked her hair, grinning wide enough to reveal the small dimple on her left cheek. The tide crept higher, swallowing the base of the rock he'd occupied. He stood, brushing sand from his trousers, crushing the cigarette butt into a stone crevice, and slinging his backpack over one shoulder to walk back toward the coastal highway. The phone buzzed non-stop inside the bag. Yet he ignored the alerts entirely, tramping 2 miles along the shore, past rusted abandoned fishing boats, half submerged in shallow surf, frayed nets tangled around their masts, useless yet still hanging, exposed to the wind. He hailed a taxi once he reached the main road, giving the driver the address for the university neighborhood. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, curious about his salt-crusted windbreaker, yet asked no questions. The car wound inland from desolate coastal lots to towering downtown office buildings, one digital billboard scrolling breaking business news. Local tech manufacturing firm, Holtz Production. Stock prices drop 5% in morning trading. Ethan glanced away, unfazed by the headline. He arrived back at Professor Wells's apartment shortly before noon to find the house empty, a handwritten note left on the coffee table. "I've retrieved files from the university research wing, pasta ingredients in the kitchen if you're hungry." Sunlight streamed through the south-facing windows, tiny dust motes swirling in golden beams above the worn living room rug. He sank onto the sofa and pulled his phone out of the backpack at last, the notification panel overflowing with missed calls and texts. Over 60 incoming alerts, most from Chloe, mixed with frantic messages from factory staff, Rick, and unfamiliar corporate numbers. Rick's texts repeated desperate pleas. Line B, shut down overnight. Line C, throwing critical errors non-stop. Clients crowding the factory lobby demanding compensation. Chloe searching every corner of the facility for you. Please return our calls. Ethan did not reply to a single message. He scrolled to the bottom of his message inbox, spotting a lone, unsent text from Chloe, visible despite the block. "I'll return the trophy. All patent author credits will be revised to your name. Please come back." A bright red exclamation mark sat beside the line. She likely had no idea blocking Sivard message delivery entirely. He stared at the sentence for a long moment, capturing a screenshot and saving it to his photo album before setting the phone aside. He boiled water for pasta, stirring tomato sauce into the pot as memories resurfaced of their cramped 30-square-foot apartment in their early graduate years. Chloe had loved cooking tomato egg pasta, dumping heaps of sugar into the broth until the sweetness bordered cloying. He'd complained about the excess sugar every time, yet polished off every full bowl without protest. Once they'd moved into a spacious modern townhouse, she'd never stepped foot in the kitchen again. He set his fork down halfway through the meal, the sauce cold on his tongue. Professor Wells returned mid-afternoon, clutching a thick manila folder stuffed with yellowed printed blueprints. "I held on to your original system architecture drafts from the master's project," he said, sliding the documents across the table. "Unrefined enterprise packaging, but every core logical framework is documented here in full." Ethan flipped through the aged pages, faded handwritten notes scrawled across the margins from years before, a crudely sketched smiley face tucked into one corner alongside a tiny promise. "For Chloe, once this project succeeds, I'll take you to that upscale sushi restaurant downtown." They'd visited the restaurant later, yet she'd forgotten he'd made that quiet vow years prior. "Thank you, Professor," he said, tucking the folder safely into his backpack. Wells settled across from him, pouring another cup of steep tea. "What's your plan moving forward? The factory can't remain offline indefinitely. Production losses aside, your entire team is unraveling under panic." "I'll head back to the facility tomorrow," Ethan answered quietly. "Tomorrow?" "I'm not ready to face her today." A faint, understanding smile tugged at the professor's lips. Young people tend to view conflict as black and white, no middle ground. Chloe bears fault for her actions, yet you must acknowledge you built this system as a closed, single-key black box from the start, planting a landmine long before this fight erupted. Ethan bowed his head, knowing the professor spoke truth. When designing the authorization protocols years ago, a quiet layer of paranoia had lingered beneath his work. Fear of being overlooked, erased, reduced to invisible labor. He'd clutched the encryption keys to his chest like a last line of defense, never anticipating the day he'd pull the trigger and cut power to his own creation. "I'll report to headquarters tomorrow," he repeated firmly. That evening, he spent hours flipping through an old photo album stored in the guest room's closet, a graduation group portrait from his master's program tucked inside. He stood awkwardly in the back row, stiff and camera-shy, while Chloe occupied the front center, grinning wide enough to reveal her small left dimple. They'd only been dating 3 months when the photo was taken. On nights, she worked late in the lab. He'd ride a beat-up second-hand bicycle to pick her up, a foam cooler strapped to the rear rack filled with warm milk. Once he'd purchased a sedan, the bike had vanished without a trace, the foam cooler discarded in a dumpster years earlier. Staring at her youthful, unguarded smile, Ethan realized he hadn't seen that unforced joy in her face in far too long. Conditions on the factory floor deteriorated faster than Chloe had predicted. At 10 a.m., the robotic arm on Line C malfunctioned during plastic molding cycles, overloading its motor and triggering a short circuit. Sparks ignited a nearby plastic waste bin, and the factory's automatic fire suppression system kicked in instantly, yet thick smoke flooded the ventilation ducts and forced Line D into emergency shutdown. 2 fire engines arrived to contain the blaze. No injuries were reported, yet photos of the smoke-filled production bay leaked to industry social media groups, prompting immediate press inquiries about operational failures. Stood in the central monitoring room, staring at the wall of screens flashing red error alerts, her blood running cold and sluggish beneath her skin. She gripped her phone, dialing Ethan once more with no response, sending dozens of unsent messages, doomed to the blocked void. The robotic arm burned out on Line C. Line C and D are fully offline. Clients are threatening legal action. The board of directors scheduled an emergency morning meeting tomorrow. Every message returned with a red failure marker, until her final, desperate plea. "At the very least, let me know you're unharmed." She set the phone down on the control console and turned to stare out the observation window, watching factory workers cluster in anxious huddles, debating the shutdown's cause. A brutal realization crashed over her. She had never fully grasped the magnitude of Ethan's database. She'd only ever quantified its benefits in spreadsheets: 20% higher production yield, reduced energy overhead, faster shipment turnaround, without comprehending every single manufacturing second relied on its real-time calculations. It was the invisible heartbeat of the facility, and she'd written the heart's creator off as disposable grunt labor. Julian arrived late afternoon, carrying a formal assessment drafted by an external algorithm consulting firm. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The proprietary self-evolving framework is highly customized and cannot be replicated by outside engineers without the original developer's core encryption credentials. He paused before Chloe, his expression tight and remorseful. I reviewed the original project filing paperwork this morning. Ethan's name sits first on the initial architecture approval draft. Chloe lifted her gaze to meet his eyes. I instructed my administrative assistant to reorder the author list on the patent filing without consulting you, Julian admitted, his voice dropping to a guilty murmur. I prioritized theoretical research contributions, yet in reality, you spent less than 30 minutes total inside B3's secure workshop, correct? Chloe's tone remained flat, unemotional. Julian's complexion paled instantly. How did you find out? Colin pulled the access log timestamps. Every entry, every minute you spent down there, documented in full. Chloe slid a printed copy of the original patent application across the console toward him. I've always respected you, Julian. You mentored me through my early research, opened countless professional doors, and I hold that gratitude close. But this patent's core innovation was coded line by line by Ethan in isolation underground. You owed me transparency before altering the official author order. Julian fell silent, searching for a rebuttal that never came. Please head home for the evening, Chloe said, massaging her throbbing temples. I will resolve the production crisis independently. He exited the room, the door's soft click echoing through the empty monitoring station for minutes afterward. Chloe returned her gaze to the flashing red error screens, yet her mind replayed the gala awards ceremony on a loop. The trophy passing from her hands to Julian's, Ethan's vacant expression in the corner, the untouched pastry before him, the empty band indentation on his finger. She recalled a quiet dinner conversation at home 1 week prior, Ethan's offhand warning. If I ever leave this company, the database will collapse. She'd brushed it off mid-email response, joking that he'd never walk away from the project he'd built from scratch. Only now did she recognize that quiet line as his final warning, a cry for respect she'd completely ignored. Her phone buzzed at 6 p.m., and she snatched it up expecting Ethan's name, only to hear the corporate vice president's sharp tone crackle through the speaker. The board demands an emergency conference first thing tomorrow morning. Come fully prepared to present a recovery plan. She hung up, slumping back against the office sofa, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing monotonously overhead. She closed her eyes, imagining Ethan beside her, silent and focused, typing a few quick parameter adjustments before murmuring the system is stable now. He'd always communicated through action rather than words, a trait she'd once dismissed as emotional detachment. The 73rd unanswered call, dialed out at 9 p.m., still met with endless busy signal. Minutes later, a single text popped onto her screen from Ethan's number, only 2 words: tomorrow. She stared at the brief message, her fingers trembling as she typed a frantic follow-up. Where are you? Are you safe? No reply arrived. She dialed his number once more, again unanswered, yet those 2 small words anchored a fragile thread of relief in her chest. He was alive, and he planned to return. She spent the night curled atop the office's compact sleeper sofa, fully clothed, waking before dawn to pitch-black skies outside the factory windows, only emergency safety lights glowing faint orange across the production floor. Splashing cold water over her face in the restroom mirror, she stared at her reflection. Heavy purple bruising beneath her eyes, disheveled loose strands of hair, faded lipstick worn completely away. She swept her hair back haphazardly and grabbed her coat, resolving to head down to B3 to see the workshop for herself. The B3 corridor looked identical to her fleeting past visits. Sterile, cool white lighting, grey anti-static walls, echoing footsteps across epoxy flooring. She reached the reinforced steel door and pressed her thumb to the fingerprint scanner, which flashed a harsh red rejection light. She'd never been granted clearance to enter the space. Ethan's biometrics alone had ever unlocked the room. She rested her palm flat against the icy metal surface, eyes closed, straining to hear the low hum of server racks hidden behind the slab, yet silence met her ears. She turned to leave as the elevator doors slid open, revealing Ethan stepping out from the car. They stood 3 paces apart in the empty corridor, overhead light stretching their shadows to opposite sides of the hallway. Ethan wore his frayed charcoal windbreaker, his backpack slung over one shoulder, calm yet bloodshot eyes, dark stubble covering his jaw. He always shaved clean every morning, without fail. "You came," Chloe whispered, her throat raw and scratchy from hours of stress. "I did." Ethan stepped past her, pressing his thumb to the scanner to slide the steel door open. He walked inside, and she lingered on the threshold, neither entering nor retreating. He settled at the control console and booted the recovery sequence, typing the 3 layers of encryption keys into the touchscreen. The progress bar advanced forward once more, this time glowing green as licensing access reinstated line by line. A, B, C, D, every grey production icon flaring bright, live green. Live data streams flooded the monitoring screens. Temperature, pressure, flow rate, chemical concentration, all variables snapping back to the algorithm's optimized baseline ranges. He glanced at the live factory camera feeds, watching robotic arms resume precise millimeter-level movement, empty transport trays refilling with molded components once more. Once the reauthorization process finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled a long, exhausted breath. The steel door remained propped open, Chloe standing in the entryway, lingering without crossing the threshold. "I've submitted formal paperwork to the patent office to revise the author order," she told him. "Your name will be listed as primary inventor on all official filings." Ethan did not turn to face her. "I didn't pull the licenses to demand a name change." "I know." Chloe stepped fully into the workshop, crossing the cold epoxy floor toward his station. "But the credit belongs to you, and I need to make that right." Ethan stood and rotated his chair to face her, the room's harsh white light illuminating both their faces. He took in her exhausted features, dark under-eye circles, messy unbrushed hair, wrinkled blazer, a far cry from her polished, unflawed gala persona. She'd been broken apart by the crisis, then pieced back together into something raw and human. "The factory was offline for 2 full days," he said quietly. "The financial losses will be substantial." "There's no need to calculate the total," Chloe cut him off. "I've directed finance to tally all damages, and every cent will be deducted from my annual performance bonus." "Your bonus won't cover the full deficit." "Then I'll pay it back incrementally over the coming years," she replied, quiet yet unshakable. "I dialed your number 73 separate times. Did you read the messages I sent?" "I saw everyone." "Why didn't you respond?" Ethan held her gaze, a heavy silence stretching between them, the server rack's steady pulsing, lights the only movement in the room. He searched for words for a long moment before settling on a simple truth. "I had no idea what to say to you." Chloe dropped her chin to stare at her scuffed high heels. Dust smudged across the toe caps from rushing through factory floors the day prior. For the first time, she realized those Polish designer shoes belonged only to boardrooms and galas. She'd never worn them down to B3, never walked this corridor, never stood beside the server racks that powered her entire career. Ethan, she lifted her head, voice trembling. I'm returning the trophy to the awards committee tomorrow to reissue the recognition properly. The trophy itself never mattered to me. Ethan's tone softened. Do you understand why I built this system in the first place? To streamline factory production efficiency. That's the end result. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. I began coding this framework, wanting to create something entirely my own, a complete project built from first concept to final execution. Once you brought the corporate board on board, it morphed into a team initiative, a research paper for Julian's academic portfolio. Every time the patent author list was altered, you never once consulted me. You only told me the reordering secured more funding, improved peer review odds, or supported Julian's academic publishing goals. Chloe pressed her lips tight together, unable to argue against his words. I never cared about name placement on a filing sheet, Ethan clarified. What hurt was that you never once considered my input relevant to the work I created. The workshop fell silent again, the server lights pulsing blue, green, white in steady rhythm behind them. Far above, the factory's restored mechanical hum rumbled low and continuous, a heartbeat thrumming beneath the facility's floors. I was wrong, Chloe whispered, clear and unmissable in the quiet room. Ethan watched her without speaking. I disrespected your years of labor, and I disrespected you as my partner, she admitted, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. I treated you like a constant, unchanging resource, like these lines of code, invisible yet guaranteed to function whenever I needed them. Ethan pivoted back to the console, tapping a sequence of keys to pull up an archived project log, pointing to a single line of text on the screen. Look here, 4 a.m., 2 years and 4 months ago, the first successful main loop run. I left a hidden comment, hoping one day she'll see this. Chloe leaned forward to pass the shorthand annotation, instantly recognizing the cryptic initials TZ8 and the date the 9th of December 2018, the day they'd watched a rescreening of Interstellar in the rain. She froze, nailed to the spot by that tiny buried line of text. You've never once looked through the raw source code, Ethan said. You only skimmed the summary reports I generated for leadership. Tears spilled freely down Chloe's cheeks, smudging her faint leftover mascara as she swiped at them with her palms, only making the streaks worse. She stood beneath B3's cold, sterile lights, surrounded by the server hardware she'd never bothered to understand, sobbing like a lost child. Ethan pulled a pack of disposable tissues from the drawer beneath the console and held them out to her. She took one, pressing it hard against her streaming eyes until the paper soaked through completely. Will you leave again? She mumbled through quiet sniffles. Ethan stared at her bowed head, her shoulders trembling gently. He recalled their first major argument years ago over a research credit dispute, her crying the exact same way in a cramped university lab beside a whirring centrifuge. Back then, she'd apologized quickly, admitting she'd rushed ahead without considering his feelings. The production lines require ongoing maintenance, he told her. I'll stay to adjust parameters. Chloe lifted her red-rimmed eyes to meet his. I'll be here every day, he added softly. She nodded slowly, wiping the last of her tears from her cheeks. By 10 a.m., all 12 monitoring wall screens blazed solid green once more. A short cheer rippled across the factory floor before the steady, rhythmic roar of automated manufacturing reclaimed the space. Compensatory shipping timelines were offered to delayed clients. The board cancelled their emergency crisis meeting, and corporate stock prices rebounded through the afternoon trading session. Julian submitted a formal resignation letter, yet Chloe declined to accept it, assigning him the task of drafting a public statement, correcting the patent author credits. He hesitated briefly before nodding in agreement, and the planned Nature Journal submission was pulled entirely, replaced with a conference paper listing Ethan as primary corresponding author. Though Ethan stated he had no interest in academic publishing accolades. Chloe slipped Ethan's wedding band back onto his keychain without his notice, tucked beside the small black encryption fob. He spotted the platinum ring hanging there later that afternoon, yet said nothing, simply looping the keychain back through his belt loop. Work gradually settled back into routine. The algorithm database continued its self-evolving optimization cycles, and Chloe submitted a formal fingerprint access request to B3, which Ethan approved without hesitation. She began descending to the workshop most evenings, pulling a folding chair beside his console to sit silently while he debugged temperature control logic, rarely speaking, only passing him fresh warm water every hour or two. One dusk, midway through rewriting a segment of thermal regulation code, Ethan heard Chloe's quiet voice from behind his chair. What does TZH stand for in that hidden comment? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, refusing to turn around. Guess? September 12th, 2018, she said softly. Our interstellar matinee, pouring rain outside the theatre. That's the date, yes. But what do the initials mean? Ethan paused for a heartbeat before answering. Terrace Zinnia Hybrid, the rose you carried that day. I planted its stem in a flower pot on my dorm balcony once we left the theatre, and it bloomed for 7 full days. Chloe fell silent for a long stretch. A moment later, Ethan felt a faint, gentle weight against his shoulder as she wrapped her arms loosely around him, light as a butterfly's landing, before stepping back to her original seat. What would you like for dinner tonight? Anything works for me, he replied. Tomato egg pasta then, she decided. Go easy on the sugar this time, he joked faintly. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound he hadn't heard in months. I'll add extra sugar anyway. That night, they sat side by side at their dining table, 2 steaming bowls of tomato egg pasta set between them. Chloe had dumped a generous scoop of sugar into her sauce, the broth cloyingly sweet against Ethan's tongue. He wrinkled his nose at the flavor, yet finished every bite without complaint, watching her across the table as a faint familiar glow returned to her eyes. The same warm light he'd seen beneath the boba shop awning all those rainy years ago. Neither of them revisited the 73 unanswered calls, the Gala champagne tower, or the crystal trophy. Some wounds had split open and scabbed over, leaving faint, unspoken marks between them, yet no longer festering raw. Ethan set his empty bowl down, picking up his keychain to twist the platinum wedding band between his thumb and forefinger, glancing from the ring to the black encryption fob beside it. 2 tiny metal trinkets glinting different hues beneath the kitchen lamp. He curled them both in his palm for a moment before clipping the chain back to his waistband. At midnight, the B3 server racks initiated an automated full data backup, a single new line of annotation stamped into the system logs, appearing as a random string of numbers to anyone who stumbled across it. Taped to the edge of Ethan's control console, a handwritten note from Chloe waited unnoticed until morning. Encryption passphrase permanently valid, no expiration. The server lights pulsed steady blue, green, white, a calm, unbroken heartbeat, beneath the factory floors. The 12 production lines churned smoothly overhead, every manufactured component calibrated to a tolerance of less than 1/1000th of an inch. Everything operated as it should. This time, the encryption keys would never be revoked.